Hello everyone. My name is Pagels-Minor, and thank you, David, for that introduction. David and I have worked together with Howard Brown for the past 5 years. I've been so proud to be a board member of Howard Brown and see the progress that we've made, specifically also for the TDNC community, of which I am a proud member of that community as well. So today we're going to talk a little bit about gender diverse identities and how you as individuals can support that group of individuals in your companies, as well as just like a general like idea of like what the community might ask of you. So my actual profession, I am a product manager, and so I have a rule. There's no such thing as a meeting, a talk, anything without an agenda. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the goals are for this, which I kind of already expressed, a bit about the history of TGNC folks. We're going to debunk some gender assumptions. We're going to talk a little bit about intersectionality, and we're going to talk about how to actively be an ally, and then finally, how to make your workplace great for TGNB folks. So to get started, it's so interesting. So I am a product manager, which means that I work on a myriad of different products. And many of the products I've worked on in my career are these like personalization products. And so it's where we might ask an individual to provide us a little bit more information about themselves, whether it's their name, their birthday, their city, and then often their gender. And I remember I was at this company a few years ago, and one of the designers came up to me and they were like, "B, I'm so excited. Look at what I did. We have this male, female, and other." And I was just like, oh, that's so great, right? Like I was very enthusiastic. And the reason for that is because really the boxes should be much more expansive than that, right? Because when you think about gender identity, first and foremost, we know that people are in different places of where they might be with their gender identity. I know for myself, when that previous slide came up, I was actually, it was the very first time I'd ever told my company that I, was a gender diverse person. I came out as non-binary. And I knew even then that like maybe I was trans non-binary, but I wasn't really comfortable expressing that to my coworkers. And so, when I look at this particular slide, it gives me a lot more opportunity to express fully who I am. And then most importantly, and it's actually really fascinating because I put this out on my Twitter and asked people to ask people why does this feel better or does this not feel better, etc. And it was actually really interesting because most people said the not listed felt really, really great. And I can imagine why, because right now there's a big debate about how many genders actually exist. So if you go to like the massive text, they generally say there's about 25 different documented genders. Although there are various websites, school of thoughts, folks who are starting to try to prove that there's more genders than that. And in fact, I even found some lists that had up to 64 different genders listed. And so what does that mean? It means that one, the gender conversation is really at its very beginning foundations. It's something that it's an area of representation that has not really been explored to its full extent. And I think even if you're out in the audience right now and you're someone who identifies as a woman, for instance, I bet that there's many times in your life where you've gone, this book is completely about men. Right. And so it's the same thing when you think about it from a TGNC perspective, because, for us, it's like those books are only about men and women and then also just mostly about men, right? And so it's this constant like desire to kind of improve the research and understanding in this area, because that's where we're really going to get to the point that we have a codified understanding of the various gender identities and also how we should be representing them. So I guess the question becomes like, how did we get to the monolith of man and woman? And so there's this actually really, really amazing book by Gregory Bolick. It's called Conversing on Gender, a primer for entering dialogue. And so specifically for many of you individuals who want to become better at this, I highly recommend this book because it kind of debunks a lot of the ideas and theories that we now currently are beholden to. So for instance, one thing that we have to remember is that before European cultural values, and I have to be even more specific, before European Christian values were kind of became pervasive around the world, it was very normal, right? And I hate using the word normal, but I think in this context it actually makes sense. It was very normal for there to be tribes and communities that had individuals that represented a wide swath of gender identities. We also, I mean, we know very specifically here in the United States, there was this idea of the two-spirit individuals, right? So we have here an example of someone who was a two-spirit person, who was well documented and lived their life fully as two-spirited before in earlier parts of the United States, before the idea of two-spirit kind of got lost to a certain extent to the wider culture and just kind of stayed within the Native American culture. We also even have experiences right now where we see these communities. For instance, right here, these are this is about a community in the Dominican Republic where these folks, these children, are born, right? They present as female, and then at some point they go through puberty, and when after they go through puberty, they present as male, right? And so like this is an actual like natural phenomenon for this particular community that again debunks this idea that like male and female is completely separate, and the fact that there's actually a lot more actual connection there than we would actually expect. And then this last example I provide this one because I think it's this really great example of like how the fact that there are certain individuals who kind of shape the history that we see, right? There's this like old quote, which is like, to the victor goes the spoils. But I think even more specifically, what we're really saying is that to the victor goes the ability to document what actually occurred in history. So this particular story, which ran in the Washington Post in 2017, is about an individual called Albert Cashier. So Albert Cashier was born as a female, and as just during a period of their life, decided that they wanted to dress as a man, joined the actual war efforts during the Civil War as a man, and then lived the rest of their life as a man. And in fact, no one even found out about the fact that Albert was not biologically male until they were in a car wreck in 1911. And it's a very interesting story because when that happened, Albert was actually committed to an insane asylum, and it became like this huge story, like this woman pretending to be a man, blah 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 blah. Blah. But it really wasn't true because Albert's like, I'm just a man. Like I don't understand what y'all are talking about because this is just who I am. And it's actually one of the really great stories about Albert's story is that when they did eventually die, their actual fellow soldiers band together to have them buried, and they were buried as Albert Cashier, which I've always appreciated as this really, really amazing story. And so I provide those three examples to show that one of the pervasive conversations that come up when you talk about trans and gender nonconforming individuals is that this is a new phenomenon. And so with these examples, we know that it's not. The idea of TGNC folks has been around for centuries. And then in certain communities, it's pervasive, right? It's something that's completely codified as a part of the community and appreciated in the community. And it's only, a more modern concept that there's this othering that has actually occurred. And so having said that, I want you to take a minute or so to think about, what were you taught about gender as a kid? How were you taught about gender as a kid? So I'm going to take about 20 seconds for you to think about that. So that was 20 seconds. And it's so interesting about this. Like, I'll share a little bit about my background. So, when I was born, my mother my mother was like over the moon about having this little girl who, she could dress up in dresses, like the frilliest dresses too. Like, honestly, I was just like, Mom, like when I look back at my pictures, I was like, did you go to stores and say, what is the frilliest, like pinkish, like girliest, like, dresses that you possibly have, right? And like I want just that dress, right? Type of thing. And it was so funny because, my mom would put me in these dresses with like these like perfect, like penny loafer type shoes. And every single day I would get in trouble in elementary school because I would be running around the field in this dress, and it would get dirty. And my mom would say, baby, this dress is too nice. Like, you need to stop doing that, right? And so it goes to this idea that gender representations started when you were a child, right? And it's because of how your, society has kind of put people in boxes. And so people try to focus on which box should you actually be in. And in fact, when you actually think about gender, these are some of the concepts that are most often associated with gender. So, like, if you're a male, you're a man, you're supposed to be manliness, and you have like this chest that exists. If you're female, you're a woman, your womanliness and your breasts. And then, the blue and pink here is very intentional, right? I have a bunch of my friends and I were all like in the process where, either some folks are pregnant or they're just about to have kids. And it's so interesting to us because all of us are having the same exact conversation, which is, why the heck is there so much blue and pink? Like, we're just going to dress our kids in yellow and green and purple and all these different colors. Because again, we realize that that type of messaging is programming our kids for a representation that might not be what they actually believe in. And so I actually like to think about it more like this. Like, so first and foremost, um, the World Health Organization specifically stated clearly there are not only females who are XX and males who are XY, but rather there is a range of chromosome complements, hormone balances, and phenotypic variations that determine sex, right? So again, like, even the World Health Organization is saying that if we look at this, if we look at science, right? If we look at science versus our own personal biases, science indicates to us that there are not just two genders, that there's a wide myriad of genders and gender representations based on your own biological components and your home hormones. And in fact, when they've done scientific studies, for instance, a trans man has had similar brain waves as, biological men. And trans women have had the same brain waves as biological women. Gender queer or uh, people who have different gender representations at a given time have actually shown completely different brain waves throughout a day, depending on which gender representation they most identify with at that given time. So science actually gives us this information that this is not a true fact, that there's women and men only. So then let's go beyond that. So my alma mater, Northwestern, actually created this really, really great diagram that kind of maps out what gender can be, right? And so what I really like about this is that, one, it highlights the complexity of both sexual identities and gender. And it also highlights a point that I've always really struggled with. Because, like, when you think about LGBTQ plus, the plus is actually ridiculously expansive. And in fact, it's this umbrella term that I feel like it kind of does a disservice to us because it makes us a little lazy because we're just like, well, the plus just captures everyone else. But the thing is everyone else under that plus has like very complex identities that often do not get represented as well as the larger LGBTQ Q, and T, right? And so one of the reasons I love this particular map is that it starts reminding us of like the different complexity that exists under the plus. So for instance, here we have like, also some common terms that get identified with this. So for instance, under the masculinity area, we have, butch or tomboy or boy or cisgender man or transgender man. We also have like these common terms that are in communities, which are like drag king and bear. Under femininity, we have drag queen, we have cisgender woman, we have femme, we have high femme, we have lipstick lesbian. And then under both, we have like genderqueer, androgynous, gender fluid, gender nonconforming. And so add to that the fact that when I look at this map, this map is actually showing an actual representation of the people I talk to and see every day. And so that's something to kind of keep in your mind as you're kind of going through your journey of trying to understand how to, make TDNC and LGBT and the general LGBTQ plus community feel more comfortable in your spaces. It's to start decoupling the gender and start thinking about, okay, if I were to talk to this person, like what might they actually identify themselves as, and then how can I create programming and actually create communities for those different individuals to feel safe and comfortable. So then let's go to the next point. So something I always like to highlight is also the complexities of intersectionality, right? So if you aren't familiar, intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, almost 30 or 40 years ago. And what's really great about that is that it actually talks about the fact that this isn't just about gender. This isn't just about race. This is actually about also class and so many other topics, and how we have to think about all of those intersectioning identities in order to make sure that we're fully thinking about how we should support different individuals. So then let's talk about my own intersectionality. So when I think about myself, I think about being a part of the larger LGBTQ community. I think about being a part of the TGNC community. I think about being, assigned female at birth. I think about being Black. I think about being Southern fried. I think about being married to my wonderful wife. And then also, I think about being a sneakerhead. It's an addiction. I know. I would say I was getting help, but I just really like shoes. So I'm just going to keep buying shoes. But when I think about my intersectionality and I go talk to folks at my job, I go, someone might come to me and go, this is a Black issue. I would like you to talk about it. And I just often go, I can't. I can't just talk about the Black issue. I have to talk about being a Black person who's also trans, who's also a lesbian, who's also married, who's also Southern, because all those different aspects really change the way in which I go into this community. And in fact, even as a Black person, I often tell folks, all I can really tell you about is being a Southern Black person, because that's really what my Blackness is steeped in versus just the general Black folks. In fact, I was telling a story today where the first time I went to college, I went to college in the Northeast, and I had previously only lived in the South. And so, like, when I first met like Black New Yorkers and Black folks from New Jersey, I was like, y'all are very different. You're much louder. You're so much more like confident than I am. And so in fact, I actually was just like, I want to be that type of Black person. I was like, y'all seem so much cooler than like my like very demure like Southern Black self. But I highlight that because it just goes to show that it's very different. And in fact, even within the TGNC community, for instance, when I think about my TGNC brothers and sisters and other siblings, it's something that always comes to mind is as a Black trans non-binary individual, I feel very different than, let's say, a white trans woman, right? It's a very different thing, especially because privilege comes into play. In fact, it's something that we constantly struggle to get through amongst like our internal ERG is, as a white trans woman, how can she lift me up to ensure that my experience is validated. Another example is, like, for instance, we've had a lot of Latinx trans folks join our group who experience transness in a different way, for instance, than how both our white and Black folks do, because there's also like the complexity of Latinx culture. And so that's something that nuance is so important to think about as you're thinking about how to set up your employees for success within your organizations. Let's talk about what it means to actually be an ally. So it's always very interesting to me when I actually go to define this, because most people have like a sense of what it means to be an ally, but then when you actually get to the textbook definition, they might question, like, am I an ally? And so first and foremost, an ally is someone who's an active, who participates in active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating. And so that means that if you're a person in a position of privilege, you're also going to use your power to seek and to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group. So what does that actually look like? I think a great example of that is even with the CEO of my current company, Reed Hastings. One of the things that he has done, so he actually started off also his career as an educator, and now he's in tech. But what he continues to do is to create organizations that help create equality and equity in education, because he realizes that being a wealthy individual who's in a position of power, if he can make education much more standard and much more equal, that he's going to empower an entire generation of people. So that's like a really large example. Let's talk about one that's like very specifically something that you might face in your particular organization. For me, like a great example is if I am in a meeting, right, and someone misgenders me, my manager actually is really great at this. He'll raise his hand and say, hey, these pronouns are they, them, and theirs, right? So first of all, he is a manager. He is like, higher up in the organization. So when other people hear him say that, they go, oh, I need to make sure I don't do that again. Because not only did I offend B potentially, but I also offended their manager who has the power to kind of give me, like, to ensure that that feedback sticks. Right. And so that type of allyship is something that's really, really amazing. Second is this idea that allyship is not an identity, right? So it's a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability. So I was actually just in a talk where we were talking about, even for folks who are considered experts at allyship, who are considered experts at being anti-racist, they still have the ability to potentially have a misstep based on their privilege. Because the thing about, when we think about concepts like white privilege, if we think about, what it actually means to be anti-racist, you're trying to deprogram yourself constantly, right? Constantly over those concepts that have been baked into your DNA, right? And so what we talk about there is this idea that what you really have to do to be a great ally is to constantly be aware of the impact that you can have and to create systems or processes to help alleviate any harm that you might cause to someone else. I mean, I think a great example, again, if we go back to that idea of um, someone misgendering me. So, for instance, I have really great relationships with people who sometimes will misgender me or, accidentally say my dead name. And the thing about that is that it's not so much the apology that I'm looking for, right? Because apology is not really what I'm looking for. I'm trying to figure out, like, are you actively, editing and policing yourself, right? So that I don't have to do that. And so a great example of something that I like to see in an example in a situation like that when it's like a one-on-one relationship is for that person to go, B, I am so sorry I misgendered you, or B, I'm so sorry I dead named you. I know that I shouldn't do that. I'm going to do better next time. And so that's a really great example of someone who is really focusing on that lifelong process and then creating systems where they can alleviate the harm that they've done. Next up is that you can't name yourself an ally. I think it's so interesting. So, for instance, you'll be on like LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter or any other number of places, and they'll say, well, I'm an ally. And I'm like, who told you you're an ally? I was like, because I didn't tell you you're an ally, right? Like, in fact, I'm actually someone who knows you. And I think that you're an ally like maybe 60% of the time. But there's like 40% of the time where like you're sketchy, right? And so that's the thing about this is that you cannot define yourself as an ally. What you want to do is if you do those first 2 points, right? If you do those first two things, hopefully folks like me who you're trying to be an ally to will say, I think you're an ally. I think you're doing a really, really great job at actually being an ally and helping support me and other people, other diverse people who need your support. And then lastly, this goes to this idea of it's super important to be intentional in how you frame the work that we do. So for instance, these are a few examples that I think are really good language to use that feels like you're being actively an ally versus performative allyship. So we are showing support for Black folks. We are showing support for TGNC folks, things like that. We're showing our commitment to ending a system of oppression by, investing in these types of resources. We are using our privilege to help by, challenging our internal institutions. So those are just the type of language that you can use when you're doing really great work in allyship. So again, that's what an actual ally is. So then let's give a few more examples of allyship in action. So this is very corny, but honestly, it works. It really, really does work. On the CTA, also in airports, if you see something, say something. So this is something, one of the most important thing I think anyone who wants to be a really great ally has to do. You have to step up in the moment and say something is wrong. And you have to step up even when people are not in the room. Like my favorite stories or my favorite moments where I feel like I'm most supported is when someone goes, by the way, B, I was in a meeting the other day and someone misgendered you, and X person actually like raised their hand and said, no, that's not B's gender. Like, this is what we're going to do. So that type of work, that's when you know that you're truly participating and being an amazing ally, is when that actually occurs. And so that also goes to this concept of challenge those around you. So one of the things that I always find like very fascinating is that, as soon as you challenge someone on something, it's like obviously there's like a couple of different ways they can react. So obviously some people will get defensive. Some people will, do the mea culpa and say like I absolutely like I'm going to learn from this. I'm going to do better. But most importantly, you actually are actively making them change how their brain works, right? So you need to make sure that you're challenging those around you, not only because you're helping create a space that's safer for TD&C folks or other diverse people, but it's also because you're helping them grow that muscle and become the kind of human that they really want to be. And then this example of speak up in front of those you wish to be an ally to, obviously, I said like it's really great to do it outside of it, but it also is really great to do it in front of people. So, for instance, I was actually in a situation recently where it wasn't related to me, right? Like it wasn't me who had the issue, but we have a new colleague at my company who is just starting a transition process. And someone actually, dead named them. And I was just like, hey, that's not their name. Their name is XYZ. And it was really interesting because, later on, that person was just like, I'm so happy you said something because, like, I just felt stuck. Like, I felt completely frozen because I'm so new in my process. I didn't really feel like I could actually say anything. Right. And so that's another reason why that's so important because in that example, she left that conversation and she was just like, well, what's really great is that since you did it for me, I now know that I can go into different spaces and say the same thing. And it goes back to the idea of helping people like grow into like a version of themselves that they're really looking to be. And then, finally, continue to be an ally even when it's hard. So this one is like really difficult for some people, right? So like it's just like, well, I did say something, I did challenge, I did speak up, but it's not working. And this person, has said that they don't really like that I keep challenging this way. And so like it might harm me or my career. And so I'm not sure if I still want to do that. And the way I always think about it is, I like, so this is kind of a little morbid thing, but I always think about this. If you were at the end of your life, if you were to die, what would you want people to say about you, right? Would you want them to say, like, this is a person who did very well at their company and got lots of promotions? Or do you want them to say, this is a person who fought for what was right? For someone who always had the courage to be brave. And there's a subtle nuance there, right? There's a subtle nuance about, thinking about like what type of character would you like people to perceive you as in the long run, right? Because this thing is hard right now, but in the space of time, it's a very small moment. And so it's always important to kind of think about that and the fact that if you really want to be a great ally, you have to do it when it's difficult. And so, having said all that, what's the next step? So, first of all, how do you actually prepare a seat at the table? And I use this specific language very specifically, right? Because if we think about DEI, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So just hiring a diverse person doesn't give you the equity and the inclusion. And so, but giving them a seat at the table to participate fully and wholly, that's how you actually complete the E and the I of DE and I. And I also have this note here that pronouns and signatures don't count. I mean, they're really great, but to be truthful, they're very passive activity, right? And so passivity is not really the way that you go about ensuring someone knows that they're fully included and fully have equity in the process. And so for this first point, ERGs are helpful, but they're only really helpful when they're well funded with advocates in leadership. And so what does that mean? I've seen a lot of ERG groups who exist and they meet and they talk. And as soon as they want to do something, it could be as simple as, let's say, the Transgender Day of Remembrance is coming up shortly. And as soon as they want to, like, let's say, have that event, instead of the company saying, oh, great, like, this is a great event, we want to support you here, they might say, oh, that's cool, but like, we don't really want to announce it, or we don't want to help, fund it to get a speaker or anything like that. And so that's again where you're like, oh, well, this ERG was created to appease people, but not actually to support the actual community and what their needs might have. Next up is like once employees are in the door, you have to ensure they receive equal opportunities. And so there's a few different ways to go about this. So first and foremost, it's about training managers about being about understanding the that a trans person, a gender nonconforming person, an L, G, or B person, a Black person, Latinx person, an Asian person should have the exact same opportunities as everyone else. For me personally, one of the struggles I've had in my career is that because I identify differently than many of my coworkers, oftentimes I wouldn't necessarily get invited to certain things. And it's very interesting. Like for instance, I was at a company and one of the directors was just like, "B, like you're so smart, you're so talented, but honestly, this pronouns thing that you're doing, it's gonna hurt your career." And I was just like, "Why? Why would it hurt my career?" And she was like, "Well, people just don't feel comfortable. They're not really sure which box to put you in." And it was like so fascinating to me because well, at first I left that company like 2 months later because it was very apparent to me that there was no way I was going to get the same opportunities as many of my other coworkers. But secondly, it goes to this idea that someone needed to help deprogram her and also the rest of leadership to understand that it does not matter what I felt like between my legs or in my head. All that mattered was about my actual performance on my job. And so then this goes to this point of like ensuring all leaders in the company and understand the importance of getting this right. So something that you've probably seen in the news is that companies like Google and Apple and a bunch of different companies are actually putting in these metrics where DEI is a part of how these individuals will get their bonuses and also have opportunities within the company. And so that's something that, obviously not every company is ready to do that, but it's a good example of companies who are really focusing on what does it look like to accomplish this goal of being really great at DEI. And so you do need to make sure that there's some kind of mechanism. One company that I worked at, I thought they really did a really great job of even from like a middle management perspective. So not just the C-suite, but from a middle management perspective, they had it set up that as a part of each of the managers' reviews, there was a section on DEI and there was a 360 review. So for instance, some of the questions that was asked was, did this person attend DEI meetings, and that included ERG meetings? Did this person, support any initiatives and all these different types of things? And what's really interesting is that like, so it, in doing poorly in that section actually would take someone from an excellent to like, just like above average, right? And so that was like, that was a tremendous economic difference for those individuals. And so all of a sudden those people started attending the events. And what's really great about them attending the events is that once they started learning, they actually became better leaders. Like, so they actually became people that like, I know I personally felt like I could trust, whereas I didn't necessarily feel like that beforehand. Next up is like you have to make sure job descriptions and the career site make it clear that there's support for diverse people. And so, one of my former companies, Sprout Social, which also is one of the sponsors for this event, they do a really good job of explaining, like, what they offer diverse people, and even in the specific requirements for their roles. And so, what that means is that like there's like I know as a diverse person, I'm much more likely to apply to that company than I would be to another company because I understand how I'm going to get that support. And so that also goes, and then it also makes it clear that I would potentially have a seat at the table. Next up is like this idea of you have to do your research to ensure your policies and health plans cover gender diverse people. So I'm very fortunate in my current company because like honestly they cover they cover things I never even knew that I might think I might need. Like that's how like great this is. However, I have been at companies where as soon as I wanted to go get some kind of like basic treatment for something related to my gender identity, it turned out that wasn't covered. And so each time one of those friction points would come up, I'd have to go to the benefits team, explain to them what happened. They would then have to try to contact the health insurance company and then see if they can negotiate something. And so what ends up happening is that I had such a negative experience. I was just like, well, maybe I should leave this company and then move to a company that actually has better health care for my identity. So those are like just a general sampling of some of the things that I think that you need to do to prepare a seat at the table for TD&C, and like I said, also like the other like the LG and B as part of this as well. So ultimately, why should you care about this? So first and foremost, the percentage of people who identify as LGBTQ by age group. So the general population is 12%. 18 to 34 is 20%. 35 to 51 is 12%, 52 to 71 is 7%, and 72 plus is 5%. So what does that mean? That means that if you were looking at all of the folks before, like the 35 and up, Like if that's the majority of the folks that you've worked with previously, you've kind of got a free pass, right? Because a smaller percentage of those individuals identified as LGBTQ, although and I have to like put my hand up and say this is like what the statistics show us, but we probably know that there are way more LGBTQ people in those groups than actually self-identified, and because they were potentially scared to self-identify. But now, if you think about this 18 to 34 group, so these are the group of people that are primarily going to be working at your company. These are the group of people that you're going to want to recruit to your company and want to stay at your company. And so you have 20% of the, the general U.S. population who are identifying as LGBTQ now, which means that if you don't do a good job of thinking about how you're going to welcome this group of individuals into your company, you're going to lose out on a huge, huge, huge cohort of folks in your company. And then other thing about that. So when I think about various statistics, various data, it shows that companies with more diverse populations, so that's diversity on racism, on race, on ethnicity, oh, race and ethnicity are the same thing, yes, on gender, on age, those companies do better than other companies, right? And so when you think about that, what we're really saying is if you don't prepare yourself, you're going to lose out on that opportunity to be a more successful company, a more profitable company. And so that's why this work is so important to do beforehand. All right, so I just spent 30 plus minutes talking about, TD&C folks, being an ally, preparing a seat at the table. And I'm going to actually end with this, which is, this is one of my favorite quotes by Segura. Gender is given too much importance. We should be able to see humans just as humans. And so I love that quote because what I'm ultimately really saying is if you take all of the differences out and just focus on people being humans, it's amazing how much easier and simpler this work becomes. So thank you. Now I'll turn it over to Richard so he can, ask me all the questions that y'all have for me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bea, for being here with us today. Hi, everyone. My name is Richard Kloss. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I am a corporate relations specialist for Howard Brown Health. Again, Bea, this was really wonderful. Thank you for joining us and sharing your story and your expertise. I really, really enjoyed this section on allyship. When I talk to our corporate partners that we work with here at Howard Brown, I feel like this is something that's really come up a lot in the last few months of how do I be a better ally? And I think the reminder that allyship is not an identity, but it's an active thing that you must continually question yourself and continue to work on yourself is a really great reminder. So thank you. Fantastic. So before we let you go, I have a few questions for you. So something that also that we hear a lot, we work with corporations that have varying DEI initiatives, and we definitely work with some that say that they come from more conservative environments, and they feel that LGBTQ plus issues are rarely prioritized and never really brought to the forefront. So do you have any advice for people on how they can, make that first step of reaching out to leadership and, getting that conversation started and making sure that their needs are met in the workplace?
So I want to clarify, is this from practitioners who want to implement programs, or is this from individuals who just are individual ICs who want their leadership to discuss this?
So these would be often our business resource groups and also just LGBTQ plus professionals and allies just working in corporate spaces.
Very great. So having had that context, I would say let's refer back to that last slide before the quote, which is the statistics about the number of LGBTQ people who actually exist in the world, right? Because if you start breaking down the numbers, it becomes an economic liability, in my opinion, right? And so one, you have that general data about how many LGBTQ people might, who exist in the world. And then secondly, there's a lot of different studies that you can do. And honestly, I just do a Google search, right? And I usually find the Harvard and the Northwestern, there are various studies that talk about LGBTQ programs and other diversity programs and how they actually increase the productivity of companies and increase the diversity of thought, which makes their products better. And so I think if you come at it from an economic opportunity versus a you should do this because it's right, it often changes a lot of people's minds. And I should also note that like I've worked at some pretty conservative companies before. I'm now like at the liberal like California tech companies. And so that's the approach that we took at some of those companies. And then once they actually started understanding the numbers, they were like, wow, that's a problem. And so that's like the positive side of it. So then the negative part about the numbers as well is if they don't do something and they are considered to be like out of compliance with like EEOC and things like that, that also is a huge economic liability, right? So you have to like put that like I always like so I like to put spreadsheets together for people to say this is the potential risk number. Do you want to deal with that? Because I don't want to deal with that. Like I don't know if our company can survive if we actually have this many cases against us. And it's very helpful, right? Because like a lot of times if people aren't mentally ready to be there, at the very least they could be scared into thinking about how to be logical about implementing some of these different programs.
Thank you. No, I think that's great. Unfortunately, we would like everyone to do this because it's right, but I like that you're saying hit them where it hurts, where the money is. So
Exactly.
thank you. All right. So also, as we're all working in this virtual space now, a lot of our business resource group leaders have asked how can they keep their members and their organizations present, and how can they keep them focused on the mission of their group, which is to promote LGBTQ equity in the workplace? Do you have any advice for people on how, like, existing in the virtual space, how they can, continue this fight and continue this work?
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting. At Netflix where I work, we've actually been doing a series of like get to know this, group of people. And so it's actually been across gender, across race, and it's also been across sexual orientation. And so what's really great about that is that they're just like little pop-ups. They're very like low key. And so for instance, like we did one that was for non-binary people. We did one for bisexual people. We've done one for like a general like pride one. We did one that was like specifically centering like Black trans individuals because like we wanted to talk about the fact that Black trans women are dying at a far higher rate than other individuals. And what's really been great about this is that by adding this programming, like what we found is that it's created a lot more questions, right? Because like once they've had these like internal panels, people are just like, wait, I didn't realize I didn't know about these things, right? And so that's the one good thing about like Zoom and things like that is that also you can record them, and so then people can also look at them at their leisure. And so like I can't tell you how many times I've got a message from someone saying, I actually didn't realize this, but I think I might be non-binary. Like I've actually gotten this like 7 times. It's been very fascinating to me, and it's just because like. Oh, and it also highlights this idea that, especially for the older generation, because they weren't a part of a generation that was so readily talking about these issues, they've never really engaged and thought about what it means to kind of be whole. Like they've just been like, well, I got married because it made sense, right? And this is what a conversation I had with someone. They were like, I got married because it made sense. I'm totally fine with my spouse. Like we're totally cool. We're best friends. We've raised the whole family, and now I realize that actually I'm non-binary. And I want to talk about that. And like I'm so happy that we had this panel because I never knew someone that I could talk about any of these things with. And so that's the other great thing about this is that it creates like the actual community. And so then like those relationships get deepened. And then again, from like the larger perspective, retention becomes deeper, right? Because that person now, we have this special relationship. We talk all the time. We have lunches together. And so they feel safer and they're happier than they've ever been, right? So one, first and foremost, I think there's a lot of opportunity to do programming that's easy to do, that's easy to kind of host and exist in different places, and it creates a lot of education. So then outside of that, the other thing that I've really found is actually create like being intentional in creating spaces. So for instance, I even put out a survey today, for instance, with some of the different groups saying, after the election, would y'all like us to actually create a space where you can decompress and without any type of like, this is for trans people or for the LG and the B and the Q or for, Black folks. It was just this idea that, we if we create opportunities for people to connect, a lot of times they won't ask for it, but by creating them independently, we're actually just inviting them to that table to sit down and actually talk about some of those like heavier issues that they may not readily talk about otherwise.
That's great. Thank you. And so another question that I've been thinking a lot about is we've seen with the social justice uprisings that happened over the summer, we've seen a lot of companies either commit or recommit to diversity, equity, and inclusion. often saying things that they're going to prioritize hiring people that identify across the gender spectrum. But then when it actually comes down to delivering on these results, they say, oh, like there weren't enough applicants, or I don't know how to reach this community. So you kind of talked about this a little bit at the making a seat at the table for folks, but I was curious if you could provide some context to how can companies be more intentional in their messaging and hiring process when looking to hire TGMB professionals?
Okay, so I'm just gonna call bullshit on that whole statement, right? I mean, so actually,
Right.
the first thing, don't be the Wells Fargo CEO. Like, don't be that guy, right? Because it turns out not only did they have a ton of Black folks who already worked there who have since left, they had there were numerous people who applied who didn't get jobs at Wells Fargo, who got jobs at other big banks. So it starts with your mindset. So I think if you have that mindset, chances are your hiring process is kind of poison, right? Because like your subordinates are going to think, oh well, our CEO said there's not enough candidates, right? It's all a lie. It's all a myth. And in fact, I can point you to like 12 groups right now who have numerous LGBTQ, Black, Latinx, Asian folks who are desperate for an opportunity to work for your company. So that's the first thing: is partner with people who are part of the communities. Partner with people who actually understand the skill sets that you might need and who can connect you with those people. In fact, a lot of my former companies, they'll reach out to me and say, "Hey, B, we really aren't getting a lot of diverse candidates. How can you help us get those folks?" And I post their jobs, right? And that's another part of it, right? So also treat people well, right? Because even if I don't work for that company, if you've treated me well, I will go out of my way to help other people get opportunities, because it's really about creating generational wealth, right? Because that's how we actually break these cycles, right? And so that's the thing. So treat people well so that they will help network for you. So that I think that's very important, because it is true. Like, for instance, if you're a cisgender white person, with all your privilege, you probably can't just go up to a Black person or LGBTQ person or a Latinx person and go, oh, I'm going to have a great opportunity for you. You do need to have probably someone, an ambassador or someone who can help ensure that person understands that it will be a place they can be successful, right? And the thing about that is, and there's also kind of a little bit of an issue, because there's some companies that are larger, so it's much easier to understand what their value add is, and there's some companies that are smaller, and so it's more difficult to understand whether those companies have the same systems in place to be a safe place. So I do think you need that ambassador who can help translate for you. And in fact, I often say that, so that's the one thing that's interesting about culture, is that there's different languages that we speak based on what our own, our own lived experiences. And so if you don't have that language, it's more difficult. But that's why you need translators, and that's why you need to invest in people, invest in time in people, because then they can go out and actually communicate that message for you. But yeah, first and foremost, it's BS that there's not a lot of people, because there's so many people. I mean, and especially in places like Chicago, I'm in a mentorship program with Roosevelt University, and there's actually 150 folks in that mentorship program, and 90% of those folks are diverse people. And so when you think about it just from that's 150 people who've put their hand up and said, I want your help to help me be excellent to get a job, right? And so that's the type of way that you have to think about this, is that there's a whole lot of people, you just don't know them yet because they're not a part of your network.
Thank you. It's funny, I feel like so much of what you've shared today and what we've talked about, it all just kind of goes back to just be a good person, just be kind.
Basically.
Yeah. Okay, so another thing that I hear a lot in working with our partners is microaggressions in the workplace are a consistent issue. So microaggression being, either accidentally being misgendered, or having your sexual orientation be assumed because of your gender identity, et cetera. And then people feel that it's difficult to navigate these conversations in a constructive way with their coworkers when they feel that the person hasn't meant to offend them. And then also on top of that, I was wondering if you have any advice on when should that conversation maybe go to leadership and go to your supervisor.
Yeah, so one of the things I actually think is a big issue is that on both sides is creating boundaries, right? So, for instance, I try very early on when I am with people, whether they're coworkers or anyone else, to explain some of the boundaries I have, so that if something comes up, they'll understand a little bit of how I'm going to operate towards them, right? So in product management, we actually call that a working agreement. So like, regardless of whether people actually realize it or not, I actually establish working agreements with almost everyone I interact with as soon as I meet them. So for instance, that starts with my name, that starts with my pronouns. That might start with me saying I'm Southern. So like I have a certain way of thinking. So for instance, I don't actually like when people curse a lot in front of me. It's like it really is like triggering to me. So for instance, I'll say like I'm super Southern. So like, I'm a little genteel, like type of thing. And it's also, and so like that's a little bit of it. So it's so the thing about microaggressions is you want to start establishing like those rules of engagement before the microaggression happens, right? So like I actually always say, as soon as you meet someone, start the work. So start the work to make sure they understand you, that they see you as human, that you see them as human, so that when something does come up, well, hopefully it's an if, not a when. Uh, but if something does come up, you have the equipment already to say, by the way, you remember the first time we met, I told you that I don't like curse words? Yeah, you just did like a whole bunch of that. It was very triggering. I didn't like it. But also to that, the same point, microaggressions don't always have to be that large, right? Like, so for instance, misgendering is very easy because almost everyone knows now that misgendering is an issue. But it also could be something as simple as, like, for instance, I remember when I was getting married, um, like typically what would happen is, if a woman was getting married in the office, the women would all get together and create like this whole big like wedding shower. They would collect money for the gift and everything like that, and they would like give it to her. Now, the majority of the folks I hung around with at that particular job were all women, right? Like I'm not gonna lie, I have a bias to being around women because women are amazing. Like, who doesn't want to be around women all the time? So I have a bias to being around women, and it was like really interesting when I was getting married because they didn't plan anything. And I was like, what the? I was like, this is really weird. Like, I'm so confused why they didn't plan anything for my wedding. And like, I'm a part of like their group, right? And so I just happened to one off mention it to someone. I was like, oh, it's like, I'm a little hurt that this like happened. And she was just like, oh, we just assumed that like, because you're like non binary, that you don't feel the same way we do about marriage. And I was just like, first of all, why would I be getting married if I didn't feel the same way you did about marriage? Like, right? So it's like a really weird assumption. But what was really weird is that like we had like I had established a rapport. Like, so we'd had many things that may have come up, whether it was about me, being non-binary or black or anything else, that I could easily say, you made a really terrible assumption. Like, in fact, you actually committed a bias against me because of my gender identity, which didn't really make sense because you know me. Like, we go out together, like we talk about the same types of things, right? Just because my gender identity is different than yours doesn't mean I don't have the same hopes and dreams and all these other things. Of course, she cried. I didn't mean to make her cry. I was just trying to like I was just preaching. Sometimes when you preach, it hits people too hard. But what really ended up happening though is that like she was just like, I cannot believe that I had such wrong assumptions. And that's a really great thing again about thinking about people as humans and then trying like I always say, and this is like really strange because even if I don't like someone, I still want them to love me. Right. And what that means is if someone like loves you and likes being around you, it completely changes the conversation. Right. It completely changes the conversation in terms of like how you can kind of go about it. And so that's also why I tell people all the time to bring your whole self to work. Right. So one, it's a good way to find out quickly if you don't have to leave that company, right? Like it's just a simple fact. Like if you're hiding a certain part of yourself, you're not going to do, it's not going to really work out well for you to kind of get a real true sense of whether it's a safe place for you. But two, by bringing your whole self, people really understand when someone's hiding a little bit behind things. And so like that thing, so it will hopefully help you understand quickly what's going on there. Now going to this idea of when you should bring it up to leadership. I think you should bring it up to leadership when you get to the point that you don't feel comfortable saying something, right? So the thing is that it's not just happening to you, right? It's just a simple fact. If they're saying this to you, they're probably saying something else to someone else. Like for instance, if you're the LGBTQ person, they're saying something that's anti the LGBTQ plus. They're probably saying something to Black people. They're probably saying something to Latinx people. They're probably saying something to Asian people. Like that's just how this works. Like if someone has a wrong idea about one group of people, they probably have a wrong idea about a lot of different groups of people. So you should just say it when you don't feel comfortable saying it to them, because what you're doing is again you're protecting. And so I always put this thing on, and this also is probably because I'm a product manager. And so I always think like if I don't say something and person X leaves the company, we're losing value. We're losing money because we have to hire someone, we have to train that person, we have to make them excellent instead of just fixing the person who made that person leave. right? And so that's the way you have to think about it. It's like you're like, I don't want to lose value at my company by not standing up and saying this person's the problem, because they do these types of things.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a good way to put it, is like, if you're not standing up for yourself, you're not standing up for anyone at your workspace. So that's great. Thank you. All right, so I have one more question for you before we let you go. What, like, 30-second piece of advice would you give yourself had at the beginning of your career, whether that be about how to exist authentically as yourself in the workplace or leading, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives?
Yeah, it's actually so funny because I spent, like, so I mentioned I didn't really come out until come out as non-binary until 2014. So I came out as a lesbian in 2000, like, four. I didn't come out as non-binary in 2014. So for 10 years, basically, I was a sad panda, right? That's what my wife calls me when I'm sad. I was a sad panda. And I was like this incomplete human who didn't have the best relationships. I didn't have the best career trajectory. And that goes to that last point that I was talking about. Is like if you're hiding part of yourself, chances are people are going to react to that because they can feel it. They notice it. And so the advice I would give is to be brave early, right? Because it would have been nice not to spend that 10 years as a sad panda and instead as this like whole happy person. So that's the first thing, is to be true to yourself as early as possible and also do the work, whether that means you have to go to therapy, whether that means you just need to be out everywhere, I don't know, but do the work to become that person. Number two, about doing initiatives at work. Again, like one of the things that I like to focus on is never making it emotional. Like it has nothing to do with me. It's about the business value that we're generating by being a better company that's safer for people, where people feel comfortable. Like if we can do those things, our company is going to be amazing. And then third is that, for me personally, my core value, the thing that I'm most excited about being, so my story, like when people, my life is over, I want people to say that B help people, right? And so like that's the thing, like figure out what that is, like that North Star is for you, right? And then once you figure out that North Star, everything else becomes much easier because you can kind of figure out what steps you have to take to get to that North Star.
Wow. Thank you, B. Thank you again so much for being here today. I know that I learned so much, and I'm sure attendees did as well. And I'm sure you're getting plenty of kudos in the event Slack channel right now. So thank you again. And all right, everyone. So before I introduce our next speaker, I wanted to just give a quick shout out to Molly Nye at Sprout Social for providing the captions for this event. We're just really thankful to have this event be more accessible. And then, all right, I'm going to turn it over to the Senior Vice President of External Relations at Howard Brown Health, Diane Pascal. She's going to give us just a quick little closing before we breakout sessions. All right, thank you.